Hello, I'm Donald McCauley, and welcome to medicsvoices.com, where we talk to the key opinion leaders in health and medicine around the world. Today we're in Vancouver, and I'm talking to Professor Michael Klein. Now, Michael, you've influenced generations of primary care researchers, but more importantly, you've never been afraid to challenge the status quo. And I think I saw you described yourself at the very beginning as a red diaper baby. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the term red diaper baby refers to the children of the left wingers dating way back to the McCarthy period. So I was one of those. My parents were very radical for the time. And so we were a generation of babies who lived and grew up in the shadow of McCarthyism.
Well, then your first degree was in political science. That obviously fed that enthusiasm for challenging politics.
Well, it was partially that, but it was also, I really didn't want to be hanging around with pre med students. So I took the bare minimum to get into medical school, but I was majoring in political science at Oberlin College.
Tell us about that experience.
Well, Oberlin College is a small Midwestern college with a very unique history. It was the first college to admit women in the United States. It was a stop on the Underground Railroad, uh, and it was the first college to admit blacks. So it was and remains a very liberal is much more than liberal, really, in its foundation.
Well, then when did you decide to do medicine, and how did that undergraduate medical training go?
Well, it was hard for me because I wasn't particularly good at math, and political science does not prepare you for medical school. And I actually prepared for both medicine and law. And I took the medical boards and the law boards, and I still scored marginally better in medicine. So I went for medicine. But getting into medical school was not easy either. And that's a whole story in itself. But I did get into Stanford Medical School, which was clearly the right choice for me.
Well, Stanford was a pretty high bar.
It was huge. I mean, they were about producing the physician scientist. And I was at the time a 5 year medical school. And I had among my classmates a number of people who already had their PhDs. Meanwhile, I was struggling to just survive the basic medical sciences. So, once again, generous classmates who found the basic sciences no problem at all helped me through.
Well, were you an activist when you were at medical school?
Well, I was active at a couple of levels. One, I joined the student AMA, the Student American Medical Association, and was working for single payer health, something which we have in Canada and we still don't have in the United States. So I was active there right from the beginning in the 1960s. I was also very much involved with the anti-Viet Nam War movement at the time.
So then you trained in pediatrics.
Yeah, well, when I was in medical school at Stanford, I never saw a family doctor. Uh, and if you've never seen one, you can't be one. And so my connection was with pediatricians who shared my politics and view of life. And so I became one of those. So I trained originally in New York at Albert Einstein, and I had never heard of family practice, really. I mean, Stanford was certainly not the place for that. And so I became a trainee in pediatrics and eventually was a certified pediatrician and later became a certified neonatologist in perinatal medicine and ran newborn intensive care units.
Well, along the way, you've had this golden career, Stanford, Albert Einstein, you're a neonatologist, but your life took a major turn in 1967. Tell us about that.
Well, that story is rather fraught. So it was very clear to me early on that I was not going to be having anything to do with the Viet Nam War, which was illegal and immoral and frankly stupid. And so I needed to stay out of the military. Unfortunately, every physician in those years was drafted, unless you had an alternative with the public health service or something similar. So I approached it from that point of view. And I actually had an appointment given to me in the U.S. Public Health Service, the CDC, actually, the Epidemic Intelligence Service. And that would have gotten me out of the military. Unfortunately, when they sent a routine inquiry to my draft board about my status, the draft board said that I was a conscientious objector. And I was an applicant. And when the U.S. Public Health Service got that response, they removed me from the Public Health Service. Because in times of national emergency, the Public Health Service could become an arm of the military. And then I was drafted. And I was actually inducted as an officer in the U.S. Military Medical Corps. And that was kind of the moment of truth for us, because there was no way I was going to actually do that. And I was headed for jail. I was going to go to jail rather than be part of the military. However, my wife Bonnie and I had some deep conversations about that. And we decided that going to Canada was much preferable to jail. And so we set out secretly to go to Canada. So what actually happened was that in the interval between being inducted as an officer in the medical corps and getting my actual assignment, we escaped to Canada in the middle of the night. And I got landed immigrant status in Canada in 20 minutes, actually.
Now, I'm fascinated because in Canada, you straddled the three disciplines of pediatrics, family medicine, and of course, your research in obstetrics. Tell us about your career as it went through McGill and into UBC.
Well, as I said, I knew nothing about family practice. So I became a pediatric resident at the Montreal Children's Hospital and completed that training and became chief resident in pediatrics at McGill. remember, I still haven't discovered family practice. So when I finally finished my training at McGill and was a certified pediatrician, I wanted to study community pediatrics. And at the time, it was not available in Canada. So I returned to the United States to do that at the University of Rochester. Now, I had managed to get back to the United States through a very complicated process, which I could tell you about, but it wasn't amnesty. It wasn't Jimmy Carter's amnesty. To make a long story very short, I had convinced the military that I was more trouble than I was worth. So that's when I went to Rochester, New York. And what happened there was that I developed a series of 3 neighborhood health centers while doing my fellowship in community pediatrics. And long story short, I discovered family practice. I was practicing as a pediatrician in one of the centers, but I found that for inner city people, the complexity of having a pediatrician, an internist, a psychiatrist, an obstetrician was just too much for these complex, very needy families. And I discovered the model, which was the one that was needed, which is a family practice model. But I never considered that I would be one. And after 5 years, I took the family practice boards and became an official family doc.
So as a family doc then, and as an academic family doc in Vancouver, you did some remarkable research, and you did a piece of research that actually changed the world. That was your trial on episiotomies. Tell us about that work.
Well, we have to go way back on that one, because while I was a medical student at Stanford, I got an international child health fellowship, and I went to Ethiopia. And it was supposed to be for 6 months. And it was an extraordinary experience because I was the only medical student in the children's hospital in Addis Ababa. And I didn't want to leave. But what used to happen back in Ethiopia was that when I had sort of put the babies to bed at night, figuratively, and being the keen medical student that I would sometimes wander over to the adjacent hospital through a short tunnel, the Princess Sahai Hospital, named after one of the daughters of the emperor, Haile Selassie. And I would attend births with the support of midwives who were doing all the births there. So paradoxically, I had not had obstetrics yet at Stanford. And I was getting experience under the support of the midwives in Ethiopia. And I learned to do births the way they did births. And those births were much less interventionistic than the typical births that take place or took place in normal obstetrics. But having not had obstetrics yet, I considered what I learned from the midwives to be normal, to be the way it was practiced. So this is a very convoluted story, but when I got back to Stanford to finish my training, one rotation of which was obstetrics, I confronted something that I did not expect. So on the first day of my rotation in OB, I had just completed a birth and I felt a heavy hand on my shoulder. And it was the professor and chair of obstetrics at Stanford. And he said to me, and these are his exact words, "Mr. Klein, if you want to practice primitive obstetrics, you'll have to go to the county hospital." So he exiled me from the Stanford University Hospital to the county hospital. Now, in US medicine, the county hospital is where poor people go who do not have coverage. The same is true today. Well, let's return to the trial for just a moment. So the trial that I did was the only, and still is, the only randomized controlled trial of episiotomy in North America. And the trial took place in 3 Montreal hospitals. And to oversimplify, the trial showed that routine episiotomy caused the very trauma that it was supposed to prevent. And it was a struggle to get funded for it and a bigger struggle to get published in conventional journals. And it was a big fight. And I was turned down by the New England Journal of Medicine and JAMA and other places. The comments of the reviewers were over the top. They were misogynistic and crazy, frankly. And I submitted then to the American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology and received the usual crazy reviews. And at that point, I couldn't take it anymore. So I called the editor of the journal and I read him the actual reviews of his reviewers. And he was frankly embarrassed. And he sent the study out again to his hand-picked reviewers. And not only was it published, but it was published in a series of 3 articles. And that basically changed the view of conventional obstetrics about episiotomy. And the episiotomy rates in the United States and Canada dropped from around 60 to 80% to about 20% in a few years. And it led to a reduction in severe trauma to the mother from 4.5% to less than 1%. Most clearly the most important thing that I've ever done. And it was accepted. And the section of the conventional obstetrical textbooks had to be rewritten, and they were rewritten. And today's obstetricians are practicing normal birth with episiotomy done only selectively and not routinely. So that was a huge change. Now, at my own hospital in Montreal, which was the Jewish General Hospital, there hadn't been a family doctor who attended a birth in 15 years. So I started attending births with the support of a lovely obstetrician, Emily Hamilton, who attended my births for about 6 months, at which point she said, "This is a waste of her time. And she said, just do it. And so I did. And then I hired family doctors who would do obstetrics as well. I selected them. And so by the time I left for Vancouver in 1993, we had gone to about 1,000 births a year, which was a huge thing in Montreal, where family doctors didn't attend births. And so we transformed that whole ethos in Montreal. And that's the way it was when I was finally recruited to be head of family practice at women's and children's hospitals in Vancouver in 93.
So now you've moved back to Vancouver and you have all these ideas for research and particularly in obstetrics. So tell us a little bit about your work in obstetrics through the lens of family medicine.
Right. So as head of family practice at women's and children's hospitals, I was head of a department that had never done any research at all. And around the same time, midwifery was coming back in Canada from a long dormant period. So I was doing two things, apart from running, which was then and still remains the largest group of family doctors attending births in Canada, which was one of the attractions of the job for me in the first place. By the way, the real reason for moving to Vancouver was because of my wife's illness. She had a brainstem stroke 36 years ago and was unable to deal with Montreal winters. She drove a scooter, which doesn't work in snow. So that was, I knew I had to leave Montreal, even though I didn't want to. And I was recruited by UBC and the then chair, Carol Herbert, who kind of created this position for me, hoping that this department would do research as well, because it certainly had the capacity to do it. And so I began looking at family practice as an opportunity to do research and also improve and strengthen the discipline at the same time. So I did a number of studies, the one of which, for example, had to do with volume, which this is an example of the kind of work I did. So at the time, there was great suspicion, particularly at the Society of Obstetricians and Gynecologists of Canada, that family doctors with low volume could be putting their patients at risk. Now, I saw no evidence for that, but I felt that we needed to study it in a careful way. So that was one example. The other thing I did, which was resisted to a certain extent by my own department, was to provide confidentially the actual data to every member of the department that they had for all the various component parts of maternity care. So every year they got their episiotomy rate, their forceps rate, their section rate, their resuscitation rate, etc. And they got it confidentially, meaning that I prohibited myself as chair from knowing the results. They got the results confidentially. They could see themselves compared to the other members of the department. And so they could see themselves against their colleagues. And Without any other intervention than that, people started changing, and the department rate of episiotomy went from 60% to 12%, and the severe trauma rate went to less than 1% from about 5%. And that was an intervention all by itself. So I did that type of study where we were looking at ourselves. The other thing that was happening, which was very controversial, was that I was embracing the new quote unquote discipline of midwifery. And many family doctors in my own department were very uneasy with that. They felt that some of them, that for a head of family practice to support midwifery was a betrayal of the discipline of family practice. And some were really furious about it. A small coterie of them actually tried to have me impeached because of my support for midwifery. And the hospital would have none of it. And in fact, what I did is I established in the pre-legalization phase a group of family doctors who would support midwives before legalization so that the midwives could prepare for legalization. And because we had been so supportive of the midwives over this period, when midwifery became legal, they had to decide where they would locate themselves academically. And they decided to become a division of family practice, which is where they are now. And I feel really satisfied and fulfilled in terms of the role that I played in making that more likely to happen.
Absolutely, and it's a tremendous accolade to you. But of course, for someone who was nearly arrested by the US, impeached by your colleagues in UBC, you really challenged authority along the way. So at the end of the day, to be awarded the Award of Canada, that must have been a really wonderful feeling.
Well, it is. It is. I've had lots of awards over the years, but that's the most important because it's the highest civilian award that is given by Canada, and that ceremony was very powerful for me and validating, and obviously very proud of it.
Michael, it's been just such a pleasure to chat to you, and thank you so much for sharing so much of your life and your career. And really, we should all be very grateful for your leadership and for your inspiration. Thank you very much indeed.
You're most welcome. It's been a pleasure.